The sterile silence of Memorial Grace Hospital's ICU, a Chicago institution where the city's most powerful families received care behind closed doors and medical miracles were purchased with unmarked bills, shattered with the sharp crack of a slap. It wasn't a dispute over treatment options or a disagreement about visiting hours. It was the fiancée of the most calculating mafia boss in the Midwest, Lillian Basham, delivering a vicious blow to an ICU nurse named Florence Salmon. Lillian was a woman known for her impeccable composure, her emotions carefully curated like art in a gallery. So what drove her to public violence over a 5-minute medication delay? The entire floor froze, the attending physicians mid-rounds, the terrified nursing staff clutching their charts, the security guard with his hand hovering over the radio at his belt. But what happened in the next 60 seconds? The nurse's impossible professional response would make the most feared man on that floor, James the architect Castillo, do something he'd never done in 18 years of controlling Chicago's underworld: order his own fiancée removed from the ICU and realize the real danger wasn't the woman who just raised her hand, but the exhausted 29-year-old nurse who had been working double shifts to pay for her mother's Alzheimer's care, who hadn't slept more than 4 hours in 3 weeks, who had survived the foster system and medical school on nothing but determination, and who just absorbed the blow without a single tear. You think you know this story? You don't. If this satisfies your hunger for stories that break your heart and put it back together, hit like right now. Share this with someone who understands that real strength isn't about fighting back. It's about standing firm when the world tries to break you. And subscribe, because what Florence Salmon did next didn't just shock the hospital. It saved the life of a dying grandmother, exposed a conspiracy that would have destroyed an entire family, and proved that sometimes the people society overlooks are the ones holding everything together. The air inside Memorial Grace's ICU was thick as molasses, heavy with the antiseptic smell of cleaning solution and the faint mechanical beeping of heart monitors. The sound of the slap still hung in the atmosphere like smoke, settling into every corner of the pale blue corridor, sliding past the nursive station where coffee had gone cold in forgotten mugs, weaving through the curtain dividers that separated life from death by nothing more than fabric. No one dared to move. Dr. Patricia Chen stood frozen 3 feet from the medication cart, a syringe still clutched in her latex-gloved hand, her mouth slightly open as if she'd been about to say something before the words died in her throat. A young resident named Marcus stood behind her, his tablet slipping from his fingers to dangle by its strap, his dark eyes wide with the kind of shock that comes from witnessing something you can't unsee. Across the hallway, a patient's family member, an elderly man in a worn cardigan, pressed himself against the wall, his gnarled hands gripping his wife's walker as if it could anchor him to safety. His wife sat motionless in her wheelchair, IV pole beside her, staring at the scene with the clouded eyes of someone whose medication made the world feel like a dream she couldn't quite wake from. Behind the glass partition of the nurse's station, Helen Rodriguez, the 43-year-old charge nurse with silver streaks in her black hair and eyes that had seen 3 decades of hospital politics, stood with one hand frozen over the phone receiver. Her face had gone pale beneath her olive complexion, the deep lines around her mouth carved even deeper by fear. She knew exactly who Lillian Basham was. She knew exactly what James Castillo was capable of. And she knew that whatever happened in the next few minutes would determine whether she'd be filing an incident report or calling the Morgan. In the corner by room 407, 2 security guards in navy blue uniforms shifted their weight uncomfortably, hands instinctively moving toward their radios, but not quite touching them. One of them, a younger man named David with kind eyes and a military haircut, looked toward the other, silently asking what they were supposed to do when the person causing the disturbance was engaged to a man who owned half the construction contracts in the city and had judges on his payroll. Yet all of those eyes, no matter how deliberately they tried to look away, were secretly watching two people. James Castillo stood motionless just outside room 408, where his grandmother Rosa lay connected to machines that beeped out the irregular rhythm of a failing heart. The fluorescent lights above cast harsh shadows across his face, highlighting the sharp line of his jaw, the slight gray at his temples that made him look distinguished rather than old at 38. He did not move. Not a single muscle in that carefully controlled face shifted. His dark eyes, the color of espresso, calculating and cold, were fixed on the scene before him, unreadable, revealing nothing of his thoughts. His hands hung loose at his sides, but there was a tension in his shoulders that anyone who knew him would recognize as dangerous. He wore a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most of the nurses made in a month. The white shirt beneath it, crisp despite the fact that he'd been in the hospital for 6 hours straight. No tie, he'd pulled it off sometime around midnight and shoved it in his pocket. Lillian Basham still stood there, her right hand suspended in the air after delivering the slap, slender fingers tipped with French manicured nails, catching the overhead lights. A 3-carat diamond engagement ring glittered on her finger like a weapon she'd just deployed. She wore an emerald green designer suit that hugged her slim figure, her platinum blonde hair swept up in a perfect chignon that hadn't moved despite the violence of her action. She was waiting for tears, waiting for apologies, waiting for the nurse to crumble to her knees and beg for forgiveness, just like the housekeeper who'd broken her favorite vase, just like the driver who'd been 2 minutes late, just like every other person beneath her station who'd learned that crossing Lillian Basham meant suffering consequences. But Florence Salmon did not break. She stood there, her left cheek blazing red as if someone had pressed a branding iron against her skin. A few strands of dark brown hair had escaped from her practical ponytail, clinging to the corner of her mouth where a thin line of blood seeped from where she'd bit her lip on impact. Her light blue scrubs, the same ones she'd been wearing for 14 straight hours, bore a small coffee stain on the sleeve and the creases of someone who'd been moving constantly since before dawn. Her eyes closed, not from pain, not from fear, but as if she were counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Her chest rose with a deep, measured breath, the kind they teach you in nursing school when you're dealing with a combative patient or a family member who's just received the worst news of their life. Slow and controlled, professional, contained. And when her eyes opened, those warm hazel eyes that held flecks of green and gold, eyes that had seen too much suffering for someone only 29 years old, what Lillian Basham saw was not the submission she had expected. It was something else entirely. Something that made the smile on her lips falter and freeze in place like a photograph of cruelty caught mid-frame. Something that caused even James Castillo, a man who had negotiated with cartel leaders without breaking a sweat and had watched rivals beg for their lives without flinching, to shift his weight almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening in a way that his security team would have recognized as the moment before a storm. Because in the eyes of that 29-year-old nurse, there were no tears, no fear, no submission. Only a terrifying calm so profound it seemed to drain the oxygen from the corridor, a quiet dignity so absolute it made everyone watching suddenly aware of their own shallow breathing, their own racing hearts, their own cowardice in the face of power. Florence Salmon moved slowly, deliberately, every motion measured and precise, as though she were performing a delicate medical procedure that required absolute focus rather than reacting to an assault. Her right hand rose, not to touch her burning cheek, not to wipe away the blood at the corner of her mouth, but to smooth down the front of her scrubs with a gesture so calm it bordered on eerie. Then she spoke. Her voice was steady, clear and utterly professional, the voice of someone who'd spent years learning to deliver devastating news to families with compassion and clarity. No tremor, no anger, just facts. Mrs. Basham, I understand you're frustrated about the delay in your grandmother-in-law's pain medication. However, administering morphine before the required 30-minute interval following her previous dose would risk respiratory depression, cardiac arrhythmia, and potentially fatal overdose. Mrs. Castillo's heart is functioning at 25% capacity. Her kidneys are processing medications at less than 40% efficiency. What seems like a minor adjustment to you could kill her within minutes. The corridor seemed to contract around those words. Kill her within minutes. Lillian's face flushed red, her mouth opening to unleash what was surely going to be a torrent of rage and threats. But before she could speak, another voice cut through the tension. Miss Salmon is correct. Everyone's head turned toward James Castillo. He moved forward with the unhurried grace of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run, closing the distance between himself and the two women in 4 measured steps. When he stopped, he positioned himself slightly in front of Florence, not quite protecting her, but making a statement nonetheless. His eyes were locked on Lillian, and the temperature in the corridor seemed to drop 10 degrees. My grandmother's medical care, he said quietly, his voice carrying despite its low volume because everyone was straining to hear, is not subject to your convenience. Miss Salmon was protecting Rosa's life. You were risking it out of impatience. He turned his head slightly, addressing the security guards who were still frozen by the wall. Escort Mrs. Basham out of the ICU. She's no longer permitted on this floor without my explicit authorization. The silence that followed was so complete that the mechanical ventilator in room 406 sounded like thunder. Lillian's face went from red to white to red again, cycling through shock, humiliation, and fury in the span of 3 seconds. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land. James, she finally managed, her voice shaking with barely contained rage, you cannot be serious. I am your fiancé, he finished coldly, which gives you access to my home, my name, and my bank account. It does not give you the right to assault medical staff or endanger my grandmother's life. He gestured to the security guards, who finally unfroze and moved forward with obvious reluctance. If you resist, James continued in that same quiet, deadly tone, I will have the hospital press charges for assault. The choice is yours. Lillian looked around the corridor wildly, seeking allies, finding none. Every person who met her eyes quickly looked away. Even Dr. Chen, who'd been at country club luncheons with Lillian's mother, suddenly became very interested in the syringe in her hand. The security guards reached Lillian's sides, not touching her, but making their presence known. This isn't over, Lillian hissed, directing her venom at Florence, who had not moved a single inch during the entire exchange. You have no idea what you've started, you insignificant little... That's enough. James's voice cracked like a whip, and Lillian actually flinched. Leave, now. And so Lillian Basham, dressed in $3,000 worth of designer clothing, dripping with diamonds and privilege, was escorted out of Memorial Grace Hospital's ICU by 2 security guards, while every doctor, nurse, and visitor watched in stunned silence. As the elevator doors closed on her fury-twisted face, the corridor remained frozen for another 3 heartbeats. Then slowly, like a held breath finally released, people began to move again. Dr. Chen continued her medication round, though her hands shook slightly. The elderly man helped his wife back to her room. The resident picked up his dropped tablet. But James Castillo did not move. He stood there, still positioned slightly in front of Florence, staring at the elevator doors as if he could see through them to the storm that would be coming. Finally, he turned to face the nurse, who had just cost him his engagement, his fiancée's political connections, and possibly his grandmother's peace of mind in her final months. Florence Salmon met his gaze directly. No fear, no gratitude, no expectation. Just that same profound calm that stopped an entire ICU in its tracks. "Mr. Castillo," she said quietly, professionally, "your grandmother's next scheduled dose is in 23 minutes. I'll be monitoring her vitals closely. If you like to sit with her until then, room 408 is the second door on your right." And then she did something that would replay in James Castillo's mind for weeks afterward. She picked up the chart she'd dropped when Lillian struck her, checked her watch, and walked calmly toward the nurse's station to document the incident as hospital protocol required. As if she just handled a routine medical situation rather than standing up to one of the most dangerous men in Chicago and his vindictive fiancée. James watched her go, his mind calculating, analyzing, reassessing everything he thought he knew about power, loyalty, and what it meant to have courage. In that moment, standing in the fluorescent-lit corridor of Memorial Grace Hospital, James the architect Castillo realized something that would change everything. He had just met the only person in 18 years who hadn't flinched in his presence, and she'd done it to save his grandmother's life. Before we continue with what happens next, I need you to understand something. Right now, as you're watching this, there's a Florence Salmon in your life. Maybe it's the nurse who stayed late to hold your grandmother's hand. Maybe it's the teacher who believed in your child when everyone else gave up. Maybe it's the server who smiled despite working 3 jobs just to survive. Maybe it's the person you walked past this morning without really seeing them. People who show up every single day, who do the right thing even when it costs them everything, who stand firm when the world tries to break them, and we don't even notice. We scroll past, we look away, we assume someone else will appreciate them. Florence almost died for her integrity. Rosa almost lost the only person who truly cared whether she lived or died. James almost destroyed the one relationship that could save him from his own isolation. If this story is making you feel something, anything, then prove it. Hit that like button, not for me, but for every Florence in your life who deserves to be seen. Drop a comment telling me about someone who showed you dignity when the world showed you contempt. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that doing the right thing, even when it's terrifying, is never wasted. And subscribe, because what I'm about to show you next isn't just a story, it's a mirror. You'll see what happens when Florence discovers that Rosa is being slowly poisoned. You'll watch her choose between saving her dying mother or saving a family she barely knows. You'll witness the moment James has to decide if he can trust someone again after 18 years of betrayal. But more than that, you'll see yourself. You'll see the moments when you chose comfort over courage, when you looked away instead of standing up, when you let someone fight alone because it wasn't your problem. This isn't just entertainment. This is about what kind of person you are when no one's watching, when doing the right thing costs you everything, when the easy choice would save you and the hard choice might destroy you. Don't scroll away from that mirror. Don't pretend you didn't see it. Like this video, comment, and share for more stories like this. Because Florence's story isn't over. Rosa's death clock is ticking, Lillian's revenge is coming, and the conspiracy goes deeper than anyone imagined. And somewhere in this story, you're going to see the moment you wished you'd been braver, the person you wished you'd defended, the right thing you wished you'd done. Watch what happens next. Let it break your heart. Let it change you. Florence Salmon's shift had begun like every other night shift in Memorial Grace Hospital's ICU, a blur of beeping monitors, whispered consultations, and the perpetual hum of machines breathing for patients who couldn't breathe for themselves. She'd clocked in at 7 p.m., her third consecutive double shift in 5 days, fueled by nothing but lukewarm coffee and the knowledge that her paycheck would cover another month of her mother's Alzheimer's care facility. Room 408 belonged to Rosa Castillo, an 82-year-old woman whose heart was giving out one labored beat at a time. Terminal heart failure, the chart said in clinical language that couldn't capture the reality of a grandmother who'd raised 7 children, survived 2 wars, and now lay connected to machines that tracked every failing function of her body with brutal precision. Florence had developed a quiet fondness for Rosa over the past 3 weeks. The elderly woman drifted in and out of consciousness, but in her lucid moments, she'd squeeze Florence's hand and whisper stories about her childhood in Sicily, about the lemon trees that grew outside her bedroom window, about the grandson who'd grown up too hard, too fast, too isolated. "He doesn't know how to let anyone close anymore," Rosa Ann murmured just 2 nights ago, her voice thin as tissue paper. After his father, after what happened, James built walls so high even I can't climb them. Florence had listened, adjusted Rose's oxygen levels, and wondered what kind of tragedy could turn a child into the man everyone in the ICU whispered about, James Castillo, the architect, a name that made even seasoned doctors nervous when they saw it on the visitor's log. Tonight, Rose's pain had been particularly severe. Florence had administered the prescribed dose of morphine at 9:47 p.m., documenting it carefully in the chart, setting her watch timer for the required 30-minute interval before the next dose could be safely given. She was checking Rose's vitals when the ICU doors burst open with enough force to make Dr. Chen look up sharply from her paperwork. Lillian Basham swept in like a winter storm, all sharp edges and cold beauty, her emerald suit immaculate, her heels clicking against the linoleum with the staccato rhythm of impatience. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd never been told no, never been denied entry, never encountered a door that didn't open at her approach. "Where is Rosa Castillo's nurse?" Her voice carried across the corridor, not quite shouting, but loud enough to make it clear she expected immediate attention. Florence stepped out of room 408, pulling the door closed behind her to shield Rosa from unnecessary noise. "I'm Miss Castillo's nurse tonight. How can I—" "She's in pain." Lillian cut her off, those pale blue eyes flashing with irritation. "I just spoke to her and she's clearly suffering. Administer her pain medication immediately." Florence glanced at her watch. 19 minutes since the last dose. She kept her voice gentle, professional. "Mrs. Basham, I understand your concern. Miss Castillo received her morphine dose 19 minutes ago. Hospital protocol requires a 30-minute interval before the next dose could be safely given." "I don't care about your protocols." Lillian stepped closer, invading Florence's personal space in a move designed to intimidate. "My future grandmother-in-law is in pain. You will give her the medication now, or I will have your nursing license revoked before morning." The corridor had gone quiet. Other nurses were pretending to work while listening intently. The security guard had moved closer, sensing potential trouble. Florence met Lillian's gaze directly. "Mrs. Basham, I understand this is difficult, but administering morphine before the required interval, especially to a patient with Miss Castillo's compromised heart and kidney function, could cause respiratory depression, cardiac arrhythmia, or fatal overdose. What seems like compassion could actually kill her within minutes." The words hung in the air between them, clinical and undeniable. Lillian's face flushed red. "How dare you speak to me about what could kill—" And then it happened. The slap, sharp and sudden, delivered with the full force of Lillian's manicured hand across Florence's left cheek. The sound cracked through the ICU like a gunshot, followed by a silence so profound that even the machines seemed to hold their breath. Florence's head snapped to the side from the impact. Pain bloomed across her face, hot and immediate. She tasted blood where her teeth had cut the inside of her lip. Strands of hair fell across her eyes. But she didn't cry out, didn't stumble, didn't raise her hand to touch the burning mark on her face. Instead, she closed her eyes, counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, drew a slow, measured breath, and when she opened her eyes again, there was no fear in them, no tears, no submission, just that terrifying professional calm that had gotten her through medical school poverty, through foster care trauma, through every moment when life had tried to break her and failed. Mrs. Basham, I understand you're frustrated, but my responsibility is to keep Miss Castillo alive, not to comply with demands that would endanger her life. The medication will be administered in 11 minutes when it's safe to do so. Lillian stared at her, mouth open, clearly expecting tears, apologies, groveling. Finding none, her rage intensified. You insignificant little, do you have any idea who I am, who my fiancé is? I could have you fired, sued, destroyed. That's enough. The voice came from behind them, low and controlled, but carrying the kind of authority that made everyone in the corridor freeze. James Castillo stood 10 feet away, having emerged from the consultation room where he'd been speaking with Rosa's cardiologist. His charcoal suit was rumpled, his tie missing, his dark eyes fixed on the scene before him with an intensity that made the temperature drop. He'd seen everything. Florence felt his gaze sweep over her, taking in the red handprint on her cheek, the blood at her lip, the way she stood perfectly upright despite having just been struck. His jaw tightened imperceptibly. Then he looked at Lillian, and something shifted in the air, something dangerous. "James," Lillian began, her voice changing, trying for something softer, more conciliatory. This nurse was refusing to give Rosa her pain medication. I was simply trying to... Miss Salmon was following hospital protocol to prevent accidentally killing my grandmother. His words were precise, surgical. You assaulted medical staff and demanded they compromise patient safety for your convenience. He turned to the security guards who'd been frozen against the wall. Escort Mrs. Basham out of the ICU. She's no longer permitted on this floor without my explicit written authorization. The silence that followed was absolute. Lillian's face cycled through shock, disbelief, humiliation, and fury in rapid succession. You cannot be serious. James, I am your fiancé. I was trying to help your... A fiancé who just assaulted the nurse saving my grandmother's life. He moved forward, positioning himself deliberately between Lillian and Florence. If you resist removal, I will ensure this hospital presses full assault charges. The choice is yours. The security guards approached reluctantly, not touching Lillian, but making their presence clear. Lillian's eyes blazed with hatred as they locked onto Florence. This isn't over. You have no idea what you've done, you pathetic... Leave. Now. James's voice cracked like a whip. And so Lillian Basham, draped in designer clothing and diamonds, was escorted out of the ICU while every witness watched in stunned silence. The elevator doors closed on her fury-twisted face, and only then did the corridor begin to breathe again. James stood motionless for 3 heartbeats. Then he turned to face Florence Salmon, the woman who just cost him his engagement and possibly ignited a war he hadn't wanted. Florence met his gaze directly. No fear, no gratitude, no expectation. Mr. Castillo, your grandmother's next scheduled dose is in 8 minutes. I'll be monitoring her vitals closely. Room 408 is the second door on your right if you'd like to sit with her. She picked up the chart she'd dropped, checked her watch, and walked calmly toward the nurse's station to document the incident, as if she'd just handled a routine medical situation rather than standing up to the fiancé of Chicago's most dangerous man. James watched her go, his analytical mind recalculating everything he thought he understood about courage, loyalty, and what it meant to have integrity when the cost was everything. In 18 years of controlling Chicago's underworld, no one had ever refused to flinch in his presence. Until tonight. Until a 29-year-old nurse chose his grandmother's life over her own safety. And in that moment, standing in the sterile corridor of Memorial Grace Hospital, James the architect Castillo realized something that would change everything. He'd just met the only person in 2 decades who couldn't be bought, threatened, or broken. Before you scroll away, I need you to sit with something uncomfortable. Right now, someone in your life is fighting a battle you know nothing about, working double shifts you don't see, choosing integrity over survival when you're not watching, standing up for what's right while you stand by in silence. Florence almost lost everything tonight, her job, her mother's care, possibly her life, because she refused to compromise her principles. How many times have you looked the other way because speaking up was too risky? How many Florence Salmons have you let fight alone because it wasn't your problem? This story isn't just entertainment, it's a mirror, and what you see might hurt. If this is making you feel something, guilt, inspiration, shame, hope, then prove you're listening. Hit that like button for every person who's shown you dignity when the world showed you contempt. Drop a comment telling me about someone who did the right thing, even when it cost them everything. And share this video with someone who needs to remember that courage doesn't always roar. Sometimes it's the quiet voice that says, I will not compromise. And subscribe, because what happens next will shatter you. Florence is about to discover that Rosa is being poisoned. James will face a choice between the woman who betrayed him and the stranger who saved his grandmother. And you'll witness the moment when doing the right thing costs more than anyone should have to pay. Don't scroll past this mirror. Don't pretend you didn't see your reflection. Watch what happens next. Let it break your heart. Let it change who you are. The shift ended at 7 a.m., but Florence didn't leave. James Castillo had asked her to stay, not demanded, not ordered, but asked in a voice that carried something she hadn't expected from a man like him: uncertainty. They sat in the hospital's family consultation room, the space where doctors delivered devastating news to relatives who would never be the same afterward. Gray walls, uncomfortable chairs, a box of tissues on the table that had absorbed more tears than anyone could count. James sat across from her, his charcoal suit jacket draped over the chair beside him, his white shirt wrinkled from hours in the ICU. He looked exhausted in a way that wealth couldn't hide, the kind of tired that came from watching someone you loved die by degrees. Rosa told me about you, he said quietly, before tonight. She said you were the only nurse who didn't treat her like a dying old woman. You talked to her about Sicilian lemons and her grandmother's recipe for caponata. Florence touched the handkerchief in her scrubs pocket, soft white cotton with delicate embroidery of lemon blossoms. Rosa had pressed it into her hand during Florence's first shift 3 weeks ago, her aged fingers surprisingly strong. Anyone who cares this much deserves something soft in this hard world, Rosa had whispered. Keep it. Remember that tenderness isn't weakness. Florence had kept it, carried it every shift since, a small reminder that beauty still existed in places filled with suffering. Your mother, James continued, and Florence's stomach dropped. He'd investigated her. Of course he had. Advanced Alzheimer's, memory care facility, $8,000 per month, you're 3 months behind on payments. Florence's jaw tightened. My financial situation isn't... Your brother Ethan, 19, accepted to Northwestern's engineering program, but deferred because you can't afford tuition. He leaned forward, those dark eyes studying her with uncomfortable intensity. Why does any of this matter to you? Because you chose to protect my grandmother when it cost you everything. His voice softened slightly. "And because I need someone I can trust, someone who can't be bought or threatened, someone whose integrity is so absolute it's almost foolish." He pulled an envelope from his jacket pocket, placed it on the table between them. $400,000 to be Rosa's private nurse at my estate. She has weeks, maybe days. I want her comfortable. I want someone who sees her as a person, not a paycheck. He paused. Someone who will tell me the truth, even when it destroys me. Florence stared at the envelope, her mind calculating. 3 months of facility payments, Ethan's tuition, the medical bills stacked on her counter, the eviction notice taped to her door this morning that she'd torn down before her younger brother could see it. Everything she needed from a man whose money came from sources she didn't want to imagine. "I can't," she whispered. "You can't afford not to." The words hung between them, brutal and true. Florence's apartment in South Chicago was exactly what $850 a month could buy. 1 bedroom split by a curtain, a kitchen with appliances from the 1990s, and windows that didn't quite close, letting in the sound of traffic and sirens and lives louder than her own. She found Ethan asleep at the tiny kitchen table, his head resting on a calculus textbook, his laptop, screen cracked, held together with duct tape, still glowing beside him. At 19, he looked younger when he slept, the worry lines smoothing from his forehead. On the counter, medical bills totaling $127,000, facility statements marked final notice, a letter from Northwestern reminding Ethan that his deferred acceptance would expire in 2 months. She found Ethan asleep at the tiny kitchen table, his head resting on a calculus textbook, his laptop, screen cracked, held together with duct tape, still glowing beside him. At 19, he looked younger when he slept, the worry lines smoothing from his forehead. On the counter, medical bills totaling $127,000, facility statements marked final notice, a letter from Northwestern reminding Ethan that his deferred acceptance would expire in 2 months. She looked at Ethan sleeping over his books, still fighting for a future that was slipping further away every day. Then she picked up her phone and typed a message to the number James Castillo had written on the envelope. "I'll do it, but I need to know, is your grandmother's care the only thing you're asking of me?" The response came within seconds. "For now, the rest depends on whether you survive what's coming." Florence stared at those words for a long moment, understanding that she'd just crossed a line she could never uncross, entered a world she might never escape. But when she looked at her sleeping brother, at the bills that would bury both of them, at a photo of a mother who no longer knew her name, she realized she'd made her choice the moment Lillian's hand had struck her face. Some bridges you burn to keep the people you love warm, even if you freeze in the process. Florence accepted the position after 36 hours without sleep, sitting in her kitchen at 3 a.m. with her mother's medical bills spread across the table like accusatory evidence. She typed the message with trembling fingers, then stared at her phone for 20 minutes before hitting send. "I accept. When do I start?" The response was immediate, as if James Castillo never slept either. "Tomorrow, 9 a.m. A car will pick you up." The Castillo estate sat 40 minutes outside Chicago, hidden behind iron gates and enough security to protect a small nation. The black SUV that collected Florence wound through manicured grounds that looked nothing like the sterile criminal empire she'd imagined. Gardens bloomed despite the late autumn chill. Stone pathways curved between ancient oak trees. The mansion itself was elegant rather than ostentatious, old money choosing discretion over display. But it was the converted West Wing that stole her breath. Someone had transformed what must have once been a ballroom into a fully functional medical suite that would put most hospitals to shame. ICU-level monitors, ventilator equipment, medication refrigerators stocked with everything Rosa might need. A hospital bed positioned near floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, because even dying people deserved to see beauty. Cost $3 million to build. The voice came from behind her, deep, gravelly, belonging to a man built like a brick wall, with silver hair and a scar bisecting his left eyebrow. Mr. Castillo wanted the best. You're it, apparently. Florence turned to face him. And you are? Marcus Chen, head of security. He crossed his arms, studying her with the same intensity she'd used to assess a patient's vitals. Need to ask you something, Nurse Salmon. Patient's DNR order says no resuscitation, but family member insists you try anyway. What do you do? A test. She recognized it immediately. I honor the patient's wishes, Florence said without hesitation. The DNR exists because the patient made a choice about their own body and their own death. Family grief doesn't override patient autonomy. Marcus's expression didn't change. Even if that family member signs your paychecks? Even then, I'm a nurse. I save lives. That's what I'll do for Mrs. Castillo, no matter who her grandson is. But I also honor dignity, autonomy, and the right to die on your own terms. Something shifted in Marcus's face. Not quite approval, but recognition. You'll do, he said gruffly. Mrs. Castillo is awake. She's been asking about you. Rosa Castillo was sitting up in bed when Florence entered, oxygen cannula in her nose, but eyes sharp as broken glass. At 82, her face was a roadmap of a life fully lived. Laugh lines around her mouth, worry creases on her forehead, the kind of gaze that could see straight through polite lies to the truth beneath. So, Rosa said, her accented English soft but clear, so you're the nurse who slapped my grandson's conscience awake. Florence moved to check Rosa's vitals, professional instinct taking over. I didn't slap anyone, Mrs. Castillo. I just refused to kill you to satisfy someone's impatience. Rosa laughed, then coughed, a wet, rattling sound that made Florence immediately adjust her oxygen levels. You're either very brave or very desperate, girl. My money's on both. Does it matter which? Not to me, but it matters to you. Question is, will you remember who you are when this is over, or will you become someone else to survive? Florence met those knowing eyes and found no easy answer. She spent the afternoon setting up protocols, organizing medications, establishing the routine that would govern Rosa's final weeks. Her hands worked automatically, checking equipment, labeling supplies, programming the IV pump, while her mind wrestled with what she'd done. Sold her services to a criminal, moved into a mansion built on suffering she couldn't see but knew existed, crossed a line between the world she understood and one governed by rules she was only beginning to comprehend. Her phone rang at 6 p.m., Ethan's name flashing on the screen. She almost didn't answer. You're really doing this? His voice was quiet, careful. Working for him? For James Castillo? Florence looked out at the gardens, at the beauty purchased with blood money, at the medical equipment that could save lives or simply delay inevitable deaths more comfortably. I'm working for her grandmother. There's a difference. Is there? The question hung between them, unanswerable. Ethan, Northwestern sent you an acceptance letter, a full ride. They want you to start in January. Florence's voice cracked slightly. That's the difference. That's what I'm doing this for. Silence stretched for long seconds. You love me, Ethan finally said, but I'm scared of who you'll become. So am I, Florence whispered. But when she hung up and returned to Rosa's bedside, when she adjusted the dying woman's pillows and checked her pain levels and saw gratitude in those ancient eyes, she wondered if maybe the soul wasn't something you sold all at once. Maybe it was something you traded in pieces, one impossible choice at a time, until you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize the person staring back. She touched Rosa's handkerchief in her pocket, soft cotton, delicate embroidery, a reminder that tenderness existed even here, and hoped it would be enough to remember who she used to be. The arrhythmia alarm shattered the 3 a.m. silence like breaking glass. Florence was out of bed before her conscious mind registered the sound. Bare feet hitting cold marble, racing down the corridor in her sleep shorts and Northwestern t-shirt. Ethan's, 2 sizes too big. Her training overriding everything else. Rose's heart monitor showed ventricular tachycardia, the chaotic rhythm that could kill within minutes. The elderly woman was conscious but gasping, her lips already turning blue, her fingers clutching at the sheets. Florence's hands moved with practiced precision. Defibrillator pads, charged to 200 joules. Clear. The shock jerked Rose's frail body. Nothing. Charged to 300. Clear. Another shock. The monitor flatlined for 1 terrible second. Then resumed. Irregular, struggling, but beating. Florence was already drawing up amiodarone, calculating dosages for Rose's weight and kidney function, administering the IV push that would stabilize the rhythm, oxygen to 100%, vital signs every 30 seconds. She didn't hear James enter, didn't register Marcus radioing to stand down the ambulance James had called, didn't notice anything except Rose's breathing evening out, color returning to her face, the monitor showing a rhythm that was weak but sustainable. Only when Rose's fingers released their death grip on the sheets did Florence allow herself to exhale. "How did you know what to do so fast?" James's voice came from the doorway. Florence didn't turn around, still adjusting Rose's oxygen levels. "Because I actually care if she lives, not because she's my paycheck, not because she's connected to someone powerful, but because she's a person whose stories deserve to be finished, even if the ending is sad." In the reflection of the darkened window, she saw James's expression shift, something unguarded passing across his face before the mask returned. The respiratory distress came 5 days later. Rosa woke choking, her airways constricting, panic flooding her eyes as her oxygen saturation plummeted to 78%. Florence performed the emergency intubation with steady hands, threading the tube through vocal cords made fragile by age, securing the airway, connecting to the ventilator. The entire procedure took 90 seconds. 90 seconds that meant the difference between brain damage and survival. Rose's eyes, conscious through the ordeal, found Florence's and held them with something that looked like understanding. "Thank you for not letting me drown in my own body." The words were unspoken, but clear. The medication reaction was the worst, an antibiotic prescribed by the hospital pharmacist without checking Rose's updated kidney function. Florence caught it during her routine labs review, creatinine levels spiking, toxic accumulation building toward renal failure. She'd stopped the medication immediately, started dialysis protocols, reversed the damage before it became irreversible. Marcus found her afterward, sitting in the medical wing's small office, hands shaking with the adrenaline crash that followed near catastrophe. Most people freeze, even trained people. They second-guess, hesitate. "You move, you just move." He paused. "Mr. Castillo made the right choice hiring you." Florence looked up at him. "He hired me because I was desperate enough to say yes. He hired you because you stood up to Lillian when everyone else looked away. The desperation just made you available. The integrity made you valuable." James started appearing during her evening medication rounds, watching from the doorway as she worked. He asked questions, not about his business, but about her decisions, why she adjusted Rose's pain medication timing, how she knew when to push for intervention versus palliative comfort, what signs she watched for in the hours before dawn when the body gave up most easily. He was learning, not just medical protocols, but how to see death as something other than failure. One night, after Florence had settled Rosa for sleep, James gestured for her to follow him to the library, a room lined with books that actually looked red, worn spines and dog-eared pages suggesting they weren't just decoration. He poured himself whiskey, offered her one. She declined. "My brother Dante died when I was 17. Asthma attack. We called 911. They said an ambulance was coming. It never did. EMTs wouldn't enter our neighborhood. Too dangerous, they said. By the time we got him to the hospital ourselves, he'd been without oxygen for 12 minutes. Brain dead." He took a long drink. "That's when I understood. The world divides people into those who deserve to be saved and those who don't. Wealthy neighborhoods get ambulances in 4 minutes. Poor ones get nothing but excuses. His jaw tightened. So I built the medical wing, made it untouchable, because no one, not my grandmother, not anyone, should die because of fear or prejudice or bureaucratic indifference. Florence stared at him, seeing suddenly the architecture underneath the monster everyone described. A 17-year-old boy holding his dying brother, building an empire on the foundation of loss. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for Dante, for what that taught you about the world." "Don't be sorry," James's voice hardened. "Be glad you understand why I do what I do, why this wing exists, why you're here." Before Florence could respond, heels clicked against marble in the hallway, sharp, impatient, familiar. Lillian appeared in the doorway, dressed in ivory Chanel, diamonds glittering at her throat like a collar made of light. "How domestic," she purred, though her eyes were ice. "James, discussing family tragedies with the help. Should I be concerned?" James's expression went carefully blank. "Lillian, I don't recall authorizing your access to the estate." "I'm your fiancée, darling. I don't need authorization. Though I see you've replaced me with a more accommodating companion, one who knows her place." Florence stood, meeting Lillian's gaze without flinching. "I know my place is with your grandmother-in-law, ensuring she doesn't die from neglect or impatience. If that threatens you, the problem isn't my place, it's yours." Lillian's smile turned knife-sharp. "Careful, Florence. People who challenge me tend to discover that accidents happen, equipment malfunctions, medication errors, such tragic, unpredictable things." The threat hung in the air, barely veiled. James moved between them, his voice dropping to something lethal. "Touch her, threaten her, even look at her wrong, and I will end this engagement and anything that comes with it. Am I clear?" For the first time, Florence saw real fear flash across Lillian's face. "Crystal," Lillian whispered, but as she turned to leave, she glanced back at Florence with a smile that promised this was far from over. And Florence understood. She hadn't just entered James's world. She'd become a target in a war she didn't understand yet. Florence found James in Rosa's room at 2 a.m., sitting in the chair beside his grandmother's bed with a stillness that looked like grief wearing a man's body. The medical equipment beeped softly in the darkness, each sound marking another moment that Rosa remained alive, each silence between beeps holding the threat of the last one. He didn't acknowledge Florence's entrance, didn't turn when she set a cup of coffee on the side table near his elbow. She'd learned his preferences over the past 3 weeks. Black, 2 sugars, strong enough to taste like punishment. She didn't speak, didn't ask if he was okay or offer platitudes about strength and time. She simply pulled over the second chair and sat beside him in the darkness. 2 people keeping vigil over a woman whose stories were running out of time to be told. Minutes passed, maybe 10, maybe 30. Time moved differently at 2 a.m. in rooms where death waited patiently in the corners. 17 years ago today, James finally said, his voice rough with disuse. Dante was shot in a convenience store parking lot. Wrong place, wrong time. Crossfire between rival crews fighting over territory that didn't matter to anyone except the people killing each other for it. He picked up the coffee, held it without drinking. He wasn't involved, wasn't even near them, just walking home from basketball practice with a scholarship letter in his backpack, full ride to Michigan State. He was going to study engineering, build bridges. James's laugh was bitter. Instead, a stray bullet hit his spine, severed it completely. He was conscious the whole time, asking me if he'd still be able to play basketball next season. Florence's throat tightened. The ambulance wouldn't come. Too dangerous, they said. Active shooting situation. By the time I got him to the emergency room myself, carrying him 6 blocks because our car wouldn't start, he'd lost too much blood. Died on the gurney before they could even get him into surgery. James finally looked at her, and his eyes held a devastation so absolute it hurt to witness. I built everything after that. The money, the power, the fear. I made sure no one in my family would ever be vulnerable again. Made sure they'd never have to beg for help that wouldn't come. Made sure they'd never be dismissed as not worth saving. He gestured around the medical wing with its millions of dollars of equipment. And now, the only family I have left is dying anyway. All this power, and I still can't save her. Florence sat with that truth for a moment, understanding, finally, the architecture of the man beside her. Not a monster, just someone who'd learned the wrong lessons from unbearable grief. I was 12 when my parents died. Car crash. Drunk driver ran a red light. They died instantly, which everyone said was a mercy, as if that made it hurt less. She stared at her hands. I had Ethan, he was 7. We'd been told we'd stay together. Social services promised, but there weren't enough foster homes willing to take 2 kids, and he was more adoptable alone, younger, fewer trauma behaviors. Her voice cracked slightly. They separated us, put me in a group home on the south side, put him with a family in Naperville who wanted a young child, not a grieving 12-year-old girl who had nightmares and cried for her brother every night. She touched Rosa's handkerchief in her pocket. I spent 6 years in different homes, wondering what was so wrong with me that no one wanted to keep me, what was so broken in me that even my own brother's foster family wouldn't make room. James was watching her now, really watching, seeing perhaps for the first time someone who understood the particular devastation of being young and powerless while the world proved it didn't care. That's why I became a nurse, so I could be the person who stays, who doesn't leave when things get hard or scary or hopeless, who sees people at their worst and doesn't look away. She met his eyes. I can't save everyone, but I can refuse to abandon them, and sometimes that's enough. Is it? James asked. Enough? I don't know, Florence admitted, but it's all I have. They sat in silence after that. 2 people shaped by loss, both terrified of caring too much, both desperate for connection they couldn't quite allow themselves to reach for. Rosa was sharper than usual the next morning, her eyes bright with the clarity that sometimes came before the end. She watched Florence check her vitals, watched James bring her breakfast himself, something he'd started doing recently, as if feeding his grandmother could somehow keep her anchored to life. You 2, Rosa said suddenly, her accented voice amused, are more alike than you know, both terrified of losing people, so you push everyone else first, both building walls so high you'll suffocate behind them before you'll risk opening a door. James set down the breakfast tray carefully. Nana, hush, I'm dying. I get to say uncomfortable truths. She reached for Florence's hand with her left, James's with her right. You think strength is standing alone, but real strength is letting someone stand beside you, is trusting someone to catch you when you fall. Her grip was surprisingly firm despite her failing body. I'm not going to be here much longer. Days, maybe a week. And when I'm gone, you're both going to be so terrified of grief that you'll run from the only people who understand. She looked between them. Don't waste the time you have building new walls. Life's too short, and loneliness is too long. Florence felt tears prick her eyes. James's jaw worked, emotion flickering across his usually controlled face. Now, Rosa said, releasing their hands, James, bring me that photo album on the bookshelf. If Florence is going to be part of this family, she should know what you look like before you turned yourself into a fortress. What followed was an hour of stories. James at 8, gap-toothed and laughing, covered in mud from climbing trees. James at 13, trying to look tough while holding a kitten. James at 16 with Dante, arms slung around each other's shoulders, before the world taught them that love made you vulnerable and vulnerability got you killed. Rosa narrated each photo with the affection of someone who'd watched a child grow into a man and mourned the softness he'd lost along the way. Florence saw James through her grandmother's eyes, not a monster, just someone who'd learned the wrong lessons from unbearable grief. When Rosa dozed off mid-story, exhausted from the effort of remembering, James found Florence watching her with an expression she couldn't quite name.
"Thank you," he said quietly, "for seeing her, for seeing this." He gestured to the photos, to the history, to the humanity beneath the reputation. "Thank you for letting me," Florence replied. Neither of them named what was growing between them, this fragile, dangerous thing that felt like trust and looked like family and terrified them both equally. 40 miles away, in Lillian's penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, expensive glassware shattered against marble walls. Lillian stood among the wreckage, chest heaving, mascara smeared from tears of rage rather than sadness. Her perfect facade had cracked completely, revealing something venomous beneath. "He chose her," she hissed to her reflection in the broken mirror. "That pathetic nurse over me, humiliated me, expelled me from his home like I was nothing." She pulled out her phone, dialed a number she'd saved under a fake name. "It's time," she said when the call connected. "I'm done waiting." The abandoned warehouse on the south side smelled of rust and decades of criminal transactions. Lillian arrived exactly at midnight, her heels echoing in the cavernous space, designer coat wrapped tight against the cold. Marcus Delacroix emerged from the shadows, a man built like a weapon, with cold eyes and a reputation for making problems disappear. He'd worked for James once, years ago, before a disagreement about methods had gotten him exiled. "Mrs. Basham," he said, his smile sharp, "you're certain about this?" "Completely." Lillian's voice was ice. "Rosa dies. The nurse takes the blame. Negligence, medication error, something that destroys her credibility. And while James is destroyed by grief, vulnerable for the first time in years, you handle him. Permanently." Marcus nodded slowly. "And your payment?" $5 million, access to James's entire operation, and the satisfaction of watching Florence Salmon lose everything she cares about before she loses her freedom. Lillian's smile was poisonous. "No one humiliates me. No one." "When?" "Soon. Rosa's dying anyway. We're just accelerating the inevitable." She turned to leave, then paused. "And Marcus, make sure the nurse suffers. I want her to know what it costs to stand in my way." In the darkness of the warehouse, two people forged a conspiracy built on wounded pride and murderous intent. Neither of them noticed the security camera hidden in the rafters, one of dozens Marcus Chen had installed months ago, always watching, always recording, always protecting the family James had built from ashes. The 2 a.m. medication round had become Florence's meditation, the quiet rhythm of checking vitals, adjusting dosages, ensuring Rosa's comfort during the hours when death waited most hungrily. The estate settled into stillness at this hour, the security team making rounds outside, the household staff long asleep, leaving only Florence and the soft beeping of monitors to mark time's passage. She was drawing up Rosa's cardiac medications when she heard it, a voice in the hallway, hushed but urgent, the kind of whisper that carried more weight than shouting. Florence froze, syringe in hand. "Has to look natural. No questions, no autopsy triggers." The voice belonged to Bradley Chen, James's attorney, a man she'd met twice, both times finding his smile too practiced, his interest in Rosa's medications too pointed for someone whose job was contracts and legal protection. Florence moved silently to the medication room door, opening it just enough to see Bradley standing near the library entrance, phone pressed to his ear, his usually immaculate suit rumpled as if he'd dressed in haste. "The grandmother's death should look natural," he continued, his voice dropping lower. "Increase the digitalis gradually, 0.2 milligrams every 3 days. Her heart's already failing. The arrhythmia will look like disease progression. No one will question it." Florence's blood turned to ice water. Digitalis, Rosa's heart medication.
Too little, and the heart failed. Too much, and it triggered fatal arrhythmias that looked exactly like the natural deterioration of congestive heart failure. Bradley listened to whoever was on the other end of the call. Lillian's paying us enough to retire, and once Rose is gone, Castillo will be vulnerable. Delacroix can move then. We'll have everything within a week. He ended the call and disappeared into the library. Florence stood paralyzed for 3 heartbeats, her mind racing through implications like a cascade of dominoes falling. Then her training took over. The medication room was her domain, every vial accounted for, every dosage documented with obsessive precision. Florence pulled Rosa's cardiac medication from the refrigerator, comparing the label to her own handwritten logs. The dosage matched what she'd been administering, but when she checked the medication against the original prescription from Dr. Westbrook, her stomach dropped. The prescription had been altered, subtly. Someone with access to the medical system had changed Rosa's digitalis dosage from 0.125 milligrams to 0.325 milligrams, a difference small enough to escape casual notice, but large enough to be lethal over time. Florence pulled her personal medication log, the backup records she kept separate from the official charts, a habit from nursing school when she'd learned that paperwork could disappear, but personal documentation saved lives. She compared her records to what she'd been actually administering. For the past week, someone had been replacing Rosa's medications. The vials Florence thought contained the correct dosage had been swapped with higher concentrations. She'd been poisoning Rosa without knowing it. Her hands shook as she held the evidence. She'd checked Rosa's digitalis levels last week. They'd been borderline high. She'd attributed it to Rosa's failing kidneys processing medications more slowly. But it wasn't natural accumulation. It was murder, methodical, calculated, using Florence's own hands as the weapon. Florence spent the next 4 hours moving through the estate like a ghost, documenting everything. She photographed medication vials with her phone, capturing lot numbers and concentration levels. She accessed Rosa's medical portal, screenshotting the altered prescriptions and comparing them to the original orders she'd saved in her personal files. She found text messages on the medical wing's shared tablet, messages between Bradley Chen and Dr. Westbrook discussing dosage adjustments in language that sounded medical but read like conspiracy. The estate's security system recorded everything. Florence accessed the backup servers, something Marcus Chen had shown her weeks ago, explaining that knowing the system meant being able to prove what happened if something went wrong. She found footage of Bradley entering the medication room 2 weeks ago, found footage of Dr. Westbrook visiting the estate at odd hours, always alone, always stopping by the medical wing, found records of calls between Lillian's phone and Bradley's encrypted line. The conspiracy assembled itself piece by piece, each element clicking into place with horrifying clarity. Lillian, wounded and vengeful, financing the operation. Marcus Delacroix, the exiled security chief with a grudge and an army. Bradley Chen providing legal cover and medical access. Dr. Westbrook altering prescriptions and making Rosa's murder look like natural death. The plan was elegant in its cruelty. Kill Rosa slowly, let Florence administer the poison unknowingly, frame her for negligence when Rosa died. James, destroyed by grief and betrayal, would be vulnerable at the funeral. Delacroix would attack then, seizing control while James was broken. Lillian would inherit James's assets through their engagement contract, and the empire would change hands without a war. Florence would spend the rest of her life in prison for a murder she'd committed without knowing. Rosa would die believing the woman she'd trusted had killed her. James would lose his grandmother and his faith in the one person who'd proven trustworthy. And Lillian would win everything. Florence sat in the small office attached to the medical wing as dawn broke, staring at her phone with its dowry of evidence that could save Rosa's life or end Florence's own. $200,000 sat in her bank account, the upfront payment for 3 months of work, enough to secure her mother's care for 2 years, enough to pay Ethan's tuition with money left over, enough to disappear tonight, take Ethan, move somewhere Lillian's reach couldn't find them. She could leave right now, take the evidence with her as insurance, vanish before anyone realized what she knew. By the time they figured it out, she'd be gone, safe. Rosa would die, but Rosa was dying anyway, wasn't she? A few days, a few weeks, did it really matter when the end was inevitable?
James would be vulnerable, but he'd built an empire on violence and fear. Maybe he deserved what was coming. Florence stared at the photo on her phone. Rosa, James, and herself from 3 days ago, taken by Marcus. Rosa in her hospital bed, looking frail but smiling. James standing close, his hand on his grandmother's shoulder. Florence beside them, caught mid-laugh at something Rosa had said. Looking like a family. A family she could abandon to save herself. A family she'd known for less than 2 months. A family that shouldn't matter more than her own survival, her brother's future, her mother's care. But Rosa's voice echoed in her memory. Real strength is letting someone stand beside you, is trusting someone to catch you when you fall. And she remembered Dante, 17 years old, dying in his brother's arms because no one had cared enough to save him. Florence closed her eyes, feeling the weight of the choice crushing her chest. Marcus appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned. "Something wrong, Nurse Salmon? You've been in here for hours." Florence looked up at him, saw the way he carried himself, loyal, protective, and honest in a world built on deception. "I need to check something. Give me 24 hours. Marcus studied her face, reading something there that made his eyes narrow. "You're scared. Of what?" "Of what happens when I do the right thing," Florence whispered. She had evidence that could save Rosa, evidence that could expose a conspiracy, evidence that would put a target on her back so large she'd never escape it. She could run, save herself, let this family, this broken, damaged, beautiful family she'd somehow stumbled into, face their fate alone. Or she could stay, fight, risk everything for people who weren't her blood, but who'd become something more dangerous than family. They'd become people she couldn't bear to lose. Florence looked at the photo again. 3 people who understood loneliness, loss, and the terrifying vulnerability of letting someone matter. Then she opened her messages and typed 3 words to James. "We need to talk." The sun rose over the Castillo estate, painting the gardens gold, and Florence Salmon, who'd spent her whole life learning how to survive by staying invisible, chose to step into the light and fight, even if it meant burning everything she'd built to keep the people she loved warm. James's office occupied the east corner of the estate, its walls lined with books on architecture and urban planning, the legitimate businesses that laundered his reputation while the real empire operated in shadows. Florence found him there at 11 p.m., standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the gardens, a glass of whiskey in his hand that he wasn't drinking. He turned when she entered, and something in her face made him set down the glass immediately. "Show me," he said. No preamble, no questions. He'd learned to read her tells, the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her phone like evidence at a trial, the exhaustion that came from carrying terrible knowledge alone. Florence spread the documentation across his mahogany desk. Photos of tampered medications, screenshots of altered prescriptions, security footage, time-stamped and damning. Text messages that read like a murder manual written in medical terminology. "Your grandmother has been poisoned," she said, her voice steady despite her hands shaking. "For the past week, someone has been replacing her digitalis with higher concentrations. The heart failure isn't progressing naturally, it's being accelerated. They're using her death to get to you." James stared at the evidence, his face carved from stone.
Only his eyes moved, tracking across documents, memorizing details, calculating implications with the precision that had made him Chicago's most dangerous strategist. "Lillian," he said finally. Not a question, a confirmation. "Lillian's financing it. Marcus Delacroix is providing the muscle. Bradley Chen has been altering medical records and coordinating logistics. Dr. Westbrook's changed the prescriptions." Florence pulled up the warehouse footage, grainy but clear enough to see. They meet at the old Hudson Steel warehouse every Wednesday at midnight. They're planning to kill Rosa, frame me for negligence, and attack you at her funeral when you're vulnerable. The silence that followed was absolute. James's hands rested on the desk, fingers spread across the evidence, and Florence could see the tension vibrating through him, controlled fury so complete it looked like stillness. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked, dangerously. "You have $200,000? You have all this evidence as insurance? You could have taken the money and run, disappeared, been safe." Florence met his gaze without flinching. "Because Rosa doesn't deserve to die in a plot she has nothing to do with. Because she gave me a handkerchief and told me tenderness wasn't weakness. Because she's the closest thing I've had to family since I was 12 years old." Her voice cracked slightly. "And because someone should have warned your brother before he walked into that crossfire. Someone should have cared enough to stand between him and the bullet." James's jaw worked, emotion flickering across his face before the mask returned. "I can't save Dante," Florence continued, "but I can save Rosa, and I can make sure the people who tried to use her death for power pay for every moment they made her suffer." James studied her for a long moment, seeing something that made his expression shift. Respect, gratitude, something deeper he couldn't quite name. "I suspected Lillian for months, found financial irregularities, money moving through accounts she thought I couldn't track, meetings she claimed were charity functions that didn't match her calendar." He touched the warehouse footage. "But I had no proof, no evidence that would hold up, so I waited, watched, wanted to see how far she'd go." His smile was bitter. "Now I know. All the way to murdering the woman who raised me, the woman who taught me that family was worth protecting, even when protection required becoming a monster." Florence watched him process the betrayal, saw the way he compartmentalized the pain, filed it away in whatever locked room he kept his grief. "What do we do?" she asked. "We let them think they're winning." James pulled out his phone, started typing rapid-fire messages. "We document everything. We control the variables, and when they make their move, we're ready." Dr. Westbrook arrived at the estate at 2 a.m., summoned by a message that offered no explanation, only a time and a location. Marcus Chen escorted him to James's office, where Florence waited beside James, the evidence laid out like an autopsy of his betrayal. The doctor's face went white when he saw the photographs. "I can explain," he started. "Don't." James's voice could have frozen blood. "You altered prescriptions for a dying woman. You used your position of trust to commit murder. The only question I have is whether you want to die slowly or quickly." It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of fact delivered with the calm certainty of someone who'd carried out worse. "Lillian said," Westbrook's voice shook. "She said Rosa was suffering, that we were being merciful, that the family wanted my grandmother alive." James leaned forward. "You have one chance to survive this. Tell me everything, every meeting, every phone call, every part of the plan." Westbrook broke. The words tumbled out. Lillian's initial approach 6 weeks ago, the promise of $2 million, the coordination with Delacroix and Bradley Chen, the plan to frame Florence, to use Rose's funeral as cover for an ambush, to take control of James's territory during the chaos. They're meeting again tomorrow night, finalizing the timeline. Rosa has maybe 3 days before the digitalis accumulation triggers fatal arrhythmia. They're planning to move the day after her death. James nodded to Marcus, who escorted Westbrook out, not to freedom, but to a secure location where he couldn't warn the other conspirators. "He'll live, for now, depending on how cooperative he remains." Rosa was awake when they came to her room, her eyes bright despite the medication, the failing body, the poison slowly accumulating in her bloodstream. "I heard," she said before they could speak. "The walls here are thick, but I'm a stubborn old woman who doesn't sleep much. I heard everything." Florence moved to check her vitals, but Rosa caught her hand.
"No fussing. Just tell me the plan." James sat on the edge of his grandmother's bed, a gesture of vulnerability Florence had never seen from him. "Nona, I'm going to ask you to do something dangerous. We need them to believe the poison is working, that you're deteriorating naturally, that they're succeeding." Rosa's smile was sharp. "So, I'll play dying even more convincingly. I've had enough practice." "It puts you at risk," Florence interjected. "Real risk. We'll be managing your digitalis levels carefully, but the margin between therapeutic and toxic is razor thin. If we miscalculate, then I die a few days earlier than I would anyway, but I die fighting." Rosa squeezed Florence's hand. "I didn't survive 84 years by hiding when my family needed me. I watched my son build this empire from nothing. I watched my grandson turn himself into a fortress after losing his brother. I'm not going to lie here quietly while cowards try to murder me in my sleep." She looked between James and Florence with fierce pride. "We fight, together, as family." The planning stretched into dawn. Marcus set up enhanced surveillance on all conspirators, tracking their movements, recording their conversations, documenting every aspect of the conspiracy. Florence established new medication protocols that would keep Rosa stable while appearing to deteriorate. James contacted his FBI liaison, Special Agent Sarah Chen, someone he'd helped years ago when her sister had been targeted by traffickers, someone who owed him enough to bend rules. "We can't make arrests until they actually attempt the murder," Sarah had said over the encrypted line. "But I can have a tactical team ready. Give me the location and timing and we'll be there." They established protocols, code words, emergency signals. "Seaside," Rosa suggested. "That's what my grandmother called Sicily, the seaside. It was always code for home, for safety. If something goes wrong, if the plan falls apart, that's our signal." Florence committed it to memory. Seaside, the word that meant run, hide, survive. But what she really heard was, "I trust you. I believe you'll protect me. I know you'll stay." On the third night, as Florence was preparing Rosa's carefully calculated dosage, enough to maintain the illusion of deterioration without actually poisoning her, James found her in the medication room. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly. "When this is over, when they come for us, you're going to be the primary target. Lillian hates you more than she hates me. Delacroix will want to eliminate you to protect himself. Bradley will try to destroy the evidence, which means destroying you." Florence didn't stop working, drawing up the precise measurements that would keep Rosa alive without actually poisoning her. "I know." "Then why are you still here?" She looked up at him, this man who'd built an empire on fear, who'd armored his heart so completely he'd forgotten how to let anyone close, who was learning, slowly, painfully, that trust was a weapon more powerful than any violence. "Because 6 years ago, I was a kid in a group home, and no one stayed. No one fought for me. No one thought I was worth the risk." Florence's voice was steady. "Rosa gave me a handkerchief and called me family. You trusted me to save her life. Marcus taught me the security codes so I could protect myself. For the first time since I was 12 years old, I belong somewhere." She finished preparing the medication, held the syringe up to check for air bubbles. "So yes, I'm terrified. Yes, I know the risks, but I'm staying. Because that's what family does. We stay, we fight, we refuse to abandon each other when things get hard." James watched her with an expression she couldn't quite read, something raw and unguarded, something that looked like the boy in Rosa's photographs before he'd learned to hide anything. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for being brave enough to stay when everyone runs." Florence smiled, tired and genuine. "Thank you for being worth staying for." They stood in the medication room as dawn broke outside.
Two people who'd spent their lives learning to survive alone, choosing, instead, to stand together. And in her room down the hall, Rosa listened to their conversation through the monitor Florence didn't know was there, smiling despite the poison in her veins and the conspiracy closing in. Her family was fighting for her, and that, she thought, was worth every remaining heartbeat. James made the announcement at 6 p.m., his voice carrying through the estate's great room with calculated enthusiasm that only Florence recognized as performance. Rosa's showing remarkable improvement. Her cardiologist is calling it unprecedented stabilization. We're celebrating with dinner tonight, family and close friends only. Florence watched from the medical wing doorway as invitations were extended. Lillian arrived first, dressed in scarlet Valentino, her smile diamond sharp. Bradley Chen came next, carrying expensive wine and nervous energy. Marcus Delacroix appeared last, moving through the estate's security with the confidence of someone who'd planned every exit route. They thought they were attending Rosa's last dinner, thought they were watching their plans succeed. They had no idea they were walking into their own funeral. Rosa played her role perfectly. She appeared in the great room for cocktails, leaning heavily on Florence's arm, her breathing labored, her skin pale enough to make the performance believable. She managed 20 minutes of small talk before her hand fluttered to her chest. "I'm sorry," she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I thought I was stronger. Florence, could you help me back to my room?" Lillian's eyes gleamed with barely concealed satisfaction. Bradley checked his watch. Delacroix's expression remained carefully neutral, but his hand moved to his jacket, checking something. A weapon, Florence realized. He'd brought a weapon to dinner. Florence helped Rosa toward the medical wing, their footsteps echoing through the marble corridor, moving away from the gathered dinner party, away from James and Marcus, away from safety. They were halfway to Rosa's room when the lights cut out. Florence's hand moved instinctively to the comm device hidden in her watch. Marcus had insisted she wear it, had drilled her on protocols she'd prayed she'd never need. "Code Silver," she whispered into the device. "Medical wing compromised." Then she heard footsteps, multiple pairs, moving fast, converging from both ends of the corridor. Delacroix's voice cut through the darkness. "Nothing personal, Nurse Salmon. You're just loose ends that need tying." Florence's training overrode her terror. She pulled Rosa toward the nearest room, not Rosa's suite, but the equipment storage room 5 doors down, smaller, defensible, stocked with supplies that could be weaponized if you knew what you were doing. They made it inside with seconds to spare. Florence slammed the door, engaged the deadbolt Marcus had insisted on installing, and dragged a metal supply cabinet across the entrance. "Rosa, behind the MRI machine, now." Rosa moved without argument, her performance dropped, her eyes sharp with adrenaline. "What do we have?" Florence scanned the room with the clinical assessment that had saved lives in emergency rooms. Defibrillator, oxygen tanks, IV poles, medication refrigerator, surgical instruments. Not weapons in any traditional sense, but everything could be a weapon if you were desperate enough. The door shuddered under the first impact. Then the second, heavy boots, multiple attackers. Florence pulled the defibrillator from the wall, checking the charge. Full power, 360 joules, enough to restart a stopped heart or stop an attacker's nervous system temporarily. She positioned herself behind the door, holding the paddles, waiting. The third kick splintered the frame. The cabinet scraped backward. A man in tactical gear pushed through. Not Delacroix, one of his mercenaries, gun raised. Florence pressed the charged paddles against his neck. The electrical shock dropped him instantly, his body convulsing, weapon clattering from his grip. Florence kicked it away, already moving, already reassessing. 2 more men appeared in the doorway. She grabbed an oxygen tank, turned the valve to maximum, and hurled a metal tray at the sparking electrical outlet behind them. The explosion wasn't Hollywood dramatic. Oxygen doesn't ignite, but the sudden pressure wave and sparking wires created enough chaos and smoke to send the attackers stumbling backward, disoriented. Florence slammed the door again, dragged another cabinet across it, bought them maybe 2 more minutes. "Rosa, how are you breathing?" "Like I'm being chased by armed men." Rosa's voice was remarkably steady, which I am, so appropriately. Florence couldn't help the hysterical laugh that escaped. She was barricaded in a storage room, fighting off mercenaries with medical equipment, and Rosa was making jokes. "If we're going to die tonight, you're going comfortable." Florence adjusted Rosa's oxygen levels, administered a mild sedative to keep her calm without compromising alertness, wrapped a blanket around her shoulders. Rosa caught her hand. "Stubborn girl, you'll do just fine in this family. We have to survive first. We will, because James won't let us die, and neither will you." In the great room, the dinner party had collapsed into chaos the moment the lights cut and gunfire erupted in the medical wing. James moved with lethal precision. Marcus's security team flooded the mansion from hidden positions. They'd been waiting, armed, prepared for exactly this scenario. Lillian tried to run, made it 3 steps before Marcus himself blocked her path, his expression carved from granite. "Sit down, Mrs. Basham." Bradley Chen collapsed immediately, hands raised, words spilling out, and panicked confession. "They promised me $5 million and immunity. I want witness protection. I want a deal. I'll testify against everyone." Dr. Westbrook was already in FBI custody. Special Agent Sarah Chen had arrested him 2 hours earlier, the moment he'd stepped onto the estate grounds. The evidence Florence had gathered was airtight: attempted murder, conspiracy, medical fraud. James stood at the center of the chaos with inhuman calm, his phone pressed to his ear, listening to Florence's whispered updates through the comm system. "She's alive," he said to Marcus. "She's fighting. Delacroix is in the medical wing with 3 men. Florence has Rosa secured." His voice remained controlled, but his hands were shaking. Marcus deployed the security team, 6 men, former military, loyal to James for reasons that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the way he'd saved their lives in ways that mattered. They moved toward the medical wing like a surgical strike. Delacroix appeared in the shattered doorway of the storage room, gun raised, his expression cold with professional annoyance. "You're resourceful," he acknowledged, "but you're cornered. Mrs. Castillo comes with me, you die quickly. You resist, you both suffer." Florence stepped between him and Rosa, empty-handed now, her makeshift weapons exhausted. "Over my dead body. That can be arranged." The gunshot never came. Marcus's voice cut through the tension. "Drop the weapon, Delacroix. You're surrounded." Security team members filled the corridor, weapons trained, tactical positions secured. Delacroix's remaining men dropped their guns immediately, recognizing a losing battle. Delacroix himself stood frozen, calculating odds, finding none in his favor. "Your choice," Marcus continued. "Surrender and face justice, resist and face something much worse." Delacroix lowered his weapon slowly, and Florence, running on nothing but adrenaline and terror, finally let herself collapse against the wall, her legs giving out, her entire body shaking. Rosa reached for her hand. "Told you we'd survive?" The great room had transformed into an impromptu interrogation chamber by the time Florence and Rosa were escorted back. FBI agents filled the space. Sarah Chen had brought her entire tactical team, having coordinated with James for days. Bradley Chen sat handcuffed, his expensive suit soaked with sweat, his confession recorded and damning. Dr. Westbrook was already being transported to federal holding. Delacroix stood in tactical custody, his expression blank, his empire dismantled in a single night. And Lillian. She stood in the center of the room, still dressed in her scarlet gown, still beautiful, still carrying herself like someone who deserved to be anywhere but in handcuffs. James approached her slowly, his face expressionless, his eyes holding something that looked like grief for what he'd almost believed could be real. "She's just a foster kid nurse, James." Lillian's voice dripped contempt, even in defeat. "I could have given you political power, social standing, an empire that people respected instead of feared, and you chose her?" James glanced at Florence, exhausted, bruised, her scrubs torn from the fight, still holding Rosa's hand like she might disappear if Florence let go. "She gave me something you never could," James said quietly. "Someone who chose my family over themselves. Someone who stood between my grandmother and death, even when it meant dying herself. Someone's loyalty can't be bought because it was never for sale. He turned back to Lillian. You tried to murder an 84-year-old woman to steal power you hadn't earned. Florence risked her life to save someone who mattered. His voice hardened. You were never going to win because you fundamentally misunderstood what makes someone valuable. Lillian's face twisted with rage. This isn't over. It is, James nodded to Sarah Chen, who stepped forward with federal arrest warrants. Conspiracy to commit murder, attempted poisoning, racketeering. You'll spend the rest of your life in a cell, and no one will remember your name except as the woman who tried to murder her way to power and failed. As FBI agents led Lillian away, her designer heels clicking against marble for the last time, her screams of protest fading, Florence watched the woman who'd slapped her disappear into the consequences of her own cruelty. Rosa squeezed her hand. Justice isn't always pretty, but it's necessary. James crossed the room, knelt in front of his grandmother, his control finally cracking. Nona, I'm so sorry. I should have protected you better. I should have... Hush, Rosa cupped his face. You protected me perfectly. You gave me a nurse who was willing to die for me. You built a family strong enough to fight together. That's all any of us can ask for. She looked between James and Florence, these two broken people who'd found each other in the worst circumstances and built something worth protecting. You saved each other, Rosa said softly. That's what family does. And in the chaos of arrests and FBI agents and the dismantling of a conspiracy, 3 people who'd learned to survive alone discovered what it meant to belong, to be chosen, to be protected, to be loved not despite their scars, but because of them. The night ended with Rosa back in her bed, Florence checking her vitals one more time, James sitting in the chair beside his grandmother, and Marcus posting guards outside with orders that no one, absolutely no one, would disturb this family again. How long? James asked, quietly, the question he'd been avoiding. Florence met his eyes. Days. Maybe a week. The poison damage accelerated things. I'm sorry. Don't be. Rosa's voice was peaceful. I got to see my grandson choose love over power. I got to fight one last battle. I got to meet the woman who'll take care of him when I'm gone. Florence's throat tightened. Rosa.
Promise me. Rosa's grip was weak but insistent. Promise me you won't let him turn back into that fortress. Promise you'll make him remember that being vulnerable isn't weakness. I promise, Florence whispered. Rosa smiled. Then I can rest. And as the first light of dawn broke over the Castillo estate, 3 people who'd survived betrayal, violence, and their own isolation held on to each other and waited for whatever came next. Together, as family. 2 weeks later, Rosa sat in a private recovery suite at Northwestern Memorial, the most secure floor money could buy, with FBI protection and James's own security team ensuring no one with bad intentions came within 100 yards of her room. She was joking with Florence about the gunfight, retelling a story with embellishments that made it sound like an action movie rather than the terrifying night it had been. And then you use the defibrillator like some kind of warrior, Rosa laughed, her color better now, the poison finally cleared from her system, though they all knew it had accelerated the inevitable. I wish I had video footage. Marcus would frame it. Florence adjusted Rosa's IV, smiling despite herself. You made jokes while we were barricaded, breathing appropriately for someone being chased by armed men. Who says that? Someone who's lived 84 years and stopped being scared of death somewhere around year 70. Rosa caught Florence's hand. Best thing that ever happened was that spoiled girl slapping you, brought you into our lives, gave James someone worth trusting, gave me a granddaughter. Florence's throat tightened. Rosa, no arguing, you're family now. Official. James found Florence in the hospital cafeteria at midnight, both of them running on caffeine and stubbornness, unable to leave Rosa even though she was stable, even though the danger had passed. I want you to stay, he said without preamble, sliding into the chair across from her. Permanently, not just as Rosa's nurse. Florence looked up from her cold coffee. James, I'm funding a trauma recovery center for at-risk youth, kids who've been through the system, who've lost family to violence, who need medical care and mental health support, and someone who understands what it's like to survive when the world says you shouldn't. He pulled out architectural plans, detailed, professional, clearly something he'd been working on for weeks. It's in Dante's name, in honor of the brother I couldn't save and all the other kids the system failed. The drawings showed a state-of-the-art facility, medical wing, therapy offices, educational spaces, residential housing for teens aging out of foster care, everything Florence had needed and never had. I want you to run the medical division, build the programs, hire staff who care rather than collect paychecks. James's eyes met hers. Partner with me, not as an employee, as someone who understands what these kids need because you've been them. Florence stared at the plans, saying her past reflected in every carefully designed space. James, this is millions of dollars. Money I have. What I don't have is someone I trust to make this matter. He paused. Someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong, when I'm being too controlling, when I'm building walls instead of bridges. She looked at him, this man who'd learned to survive by becoming feared, who was slowly, painfully learning to be human again. I'll do it, she said quietly, but not for the salary, for Dante, for every kid who died waiting for help that never came. James's expression shifted, relief, gratitude, something deeper he couldn't quite name. There's something else. He pulled an envelope from his jacket. Legal power of attorney for my medical care. If I'm ever incapacitated, coma, severe injury, anything, you make all decisions. Not my business partners, not distant relatives, you. Florence stared at the document, understanding the weight of what he was offering. A man who controlled an empire, who trusted no one, who'd spent 18 years building walls so high no one could breach them. He was giving him his life. Why me? Her voice was barely a whisper. You've known me 3 months. Your attorney will say this is insane. Your business partners will claim I'm manipulating you. Why would you? Because when you had every reason to run, when you had money, evidence, a safe escape route, you stayed. When you could have let my grandmother die and blamed it on nature, you fought mercenaries with a defibrillator and an oxygen tank. James leaned forward. That's who I want making decisions about my life. Someone who chooses loyalty over survival. Someone who sees people instead of assets. Florence's hands shook as she held the document. This kind of trust? James, people spend decades building this. You're giving it to me after 3 months. I've spent 18 years learning to read people, learning when someone's loyalty can be bought and when it's just who they are. His voice softened. You're who you are. That's why you're terrified of accepting this, because you understand what it means. She did understand. This wasn't just a legal document. It was James admitting he was human, vulnerable, mortal. It was him saying, I trust you with the thing I've protected most desperately, myself. I accept, Florence said. Not because I want the power, but because Rosa has become the grandmother I needed, because you've become family, because when this family needs someone to stay, I won't be the one who runs. The family dinner happened on a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the conspiracy collapsed, with Rosa home from the hospital and determined to cook, despite Florence's protests. The Castillo estate's kitchen had been transformed. Rosa directed operations from a chair at the center island, her oxygen cannula in place, but her spirit undimmed, teaching Florence's mother, Claire, having one of her increasingly rare lucid days, how to make traditional Italian gnocchi. Claire's hands worked the dough with muscle memory from before the Alzheimer's had stolen her recent memories, and she was laughing at Rosa's story about learning to cook from her own grandmother in Sicily. The secret is in the fork ridges, Rosa explained. Each little line catches the sauce. That's what makes it perfect. Florence watched from the doorway, her heart so full it hurt. Her mother didn't remember her name today, but she was happy, present, engaged. Rosa was treating her like a person rather than a diagnosis, and for this one evening, Florence had her mother back. Ethan appeared beside her, wearing his Northwestern sweatshirt, pre-med track, he'd decided, after watching Florence survive everything the past months had thrown at her. "You did it," he said quietly. "You saved us, got me into school, got Mom stable care, found a family that actually—" He trailed off, emotion thick in his voice. "Stays," Florence finished. "Found a family that stays."
In the dining room, Marcus was setting the table, the gruff security chief who'd become something like an uncle, who checked on Florence daily, who'd taught her self-defense because next time I want you armed properly, not improvising with hospital equipment. James emerged from his office, drawn by the laughter and warmth, looking almost uncomfortable with the normalcy of it. He'd spent so long in the darkness that standing in the light felt foreign. Florence caught his eye, smiled, and watched some of that discomfort ease. They gathered around the table, Rosa at the head, Florence and James on either side, Ethan and Claire, Marcus claiming he was just security, but accepting a plate anyway because Rosa wouldn't hear otherwise. It wasn't a traditional family. It was better. It was chosen, built from trauma and loyalty and the radical act of staying when leaving would be easier. Later, after dinner, after Claire had faded back into confusion and Ethan had helped her to the guest room, after Rosa had been settled for the night, Florence found James in the garden. He stood among the lemon trees Rosa had insisted on planting, to remember Sicily, she'd said, though they required greenhouse maintenance to survive Chicago winters. "You taught me something, Nurse Salmon," James said without turning. "Family isn't about blood. It's about who stays when staying is the hardest choice, who fights when running would be safer, who chooses you not because they have to, but because they want to." Florence stood beside him, both of them looking at the estate that had become home. "Rosa said something similar when I first met her." Florence touched the handkerchief in her pocket. She still carried it, a reminder of the moment everything changed. She said tenderness wasn't weakness, that caring was a strength people underestimated. She was right. James finally looked at her. "I spent 18 years believing strength meant standing alone, being feared, never showing vulnerability. And then a 29-year-old nurse walked into my life and proved that the strongest thing you can do is choose someone else's life over your own safety." They stood in silence, two people who'd survived by isolating themselves, learning instead to be part of something larger. "Thank you," James said quietly, "for saving my grandmother, for staying, for teaching me that family is something you build, not something you're born into." Florence smiled. "Thank you for giving me a reason to stay." Above them, the stars emerged in the Chicago sky, and inside the estate, Rosa listened to her family's voices through the open windows, her heart failing, but her spirit at peace. She'd lived long enough to see her grandson learn to love again, long enough to give Florence the family she'd always deserved, long enough to know that when she left, she'd be leaving them stronger together than they'd ever been apart. And that, she thought as sleep claimed her, was the best ending anyone could ask for. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to act with integrity when fear would be the easier path. And sometimes, the strongest bond isn't formed through power or wealth, but through the simple act of choosing someone else's life over your own comfort. True family isn't who you're born to, it's who you'd risk everything to protect. It's who stays when the world gives them every reason to run. It's who sees you at your worst and chooses to stand beside you anyway. Florence Salmon walked into Memorial Grace Hospital expecting just another shift. She walked out with the family she'd built from loyalty, trust, and the radical act of refusing to abandon people who needed her. Sometimes the people society overlooks, the nurses working triple shifts, the foster kids aging out of the system, the ones who've learned to survive by becoming invisible, are the ones holding everything together. Don't overlook them. Don't scroll past them. Don't assume someone else will see their value. Be the person who stays, who fights, who chooses loyalty over convenience. Because that's what changes everything. That's what saves lives. That's what makes a family. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that strength comes in quiet forms and family is built through choice rather than blood, then don't let it end here. Like this video for everyone who's ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told they don't matter. Comment and share about someone who stayed when everyone else left, someone who showed you that loyalty is real and courage is choosing love over fear. And subscribe, because stories like this matter, and people like Florence deserve to be seen. The world needs more people who stand between others in danger, more people who choose integrity over survival, more people who build families from loyalty rather than obligation. Be that person. See those people. Remember that sometimes the smallest acts of courage, refusing to abandon someone, standing up when everyone else looks away, choosing compassion when cruelty would be easier, are what changed the world. This is Florence's story, but it could be yours too. What will you choose?